Hey guys, welcome to another edition of Live Dive. I hope you're having a great week and that you had a great weekend. Speaking of the weekend, for those of you that came out to our Hands and Feet outreach on Saturday, thank you so much for coming out. It means the world to me. And you guys helped us pack bags full of different items and toiletries, food. We even had some tracts and some business cards with the address of our church on it, and we were able to hand out some of those to some homeless people and people in need right in the heart of what's called Suitcase City in Temple Terrace, where there's a lot of people in need. And so we were able to make a positive impact in our community. And so I really appreciate you guys coming out and doing that. So let's dive into what we want to talk about today. Many of you know that for the last month or so, what we've been doing is going through the Lord's Prayer, or the model prayer. And we've been doing that through a series called Pray Like This. And it's all about how Jesus's model prayer is truly something that we need to model our own prayer lives after. And so what we've been focusing on for the last few weeks is the fact that the Lord's Prayer really started with focusing on God, talking about God's name and His will and His kingdom to come. So now we're going to shift to actually bringing our prayer requests to God, bringing our petitions to Him. And so Jesus gives us that after He says, our Father which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. And He says, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. So all of that is about God, right? So then you go to Matthew chapter 6, verse 11, and this is what it says. Give us this day our daily bread. A very simple verse, and it's the first petition that Jesus brings to God in this prayer, is give us this day our daily bread. Now, when you look at that word bread, when you kind of translate it from the original Greek text, it really does seem to be quite literally food. He's talking about food, and when he says our daily bread, he's telling God, not only do I want you to provide for me today, I want you to provide for me every day, the things that I need. And when you look at this, Bible scholars like to compare it to what we see all the way towards the beginning of the Bible in the book of Exodus. And in chapter 16 of Exodus, we see Moses is leading the Israelites, obviously out of Egypt, and they're heading towards the Promised Land. And so the Israelites needed food on a daily basis. And so we see that God provides for them in several different ways. And one of the ways was manna, which would be bread, falling from heaven. And I found an image that I really liked, a famous painting that kind of portrayed this manna falling from heaven and the Israelites gathering it up. And every day this manna fell from heaven and the Israelites would gather it for them to be able to eat for the day. And so what Jesus is saying here is he's saying, you know what, God, just as you provided for the Israelites every day the bread that they needed, I'm asking you today to provide for me what I need. And not only today, but tomorrow and the next day. I need you to provide for me every day, daily. Now, what we're seeing here is what Jesus is saying to His disciples and to us through this prayer is that when we bring our petitions to God, we have to understand something. We have to be able to communicate in our prayers that we are completely dependent on God. You see that? He's asking God to provide for him, things that we might think, well, I can get food on a daily basis. No, you have to understand that we have to communicate to Him through our petitions that we are completely dependent on God. So even when it seems like it's about us in this prayer, it's really about God. But here's why we need to communicate through our petitions our complete dependence on God. See, when we do that, that is when God truly begins to move in our lives. When we communicate to Him that we are dependent solely on Him, that's when He begins to move. I kind of got that from a great quote from one of the greatest preachers and one of the greatest Christian minds of the 20th century. His name was Oswald Chambers, and he was also a great author. And he wrote this at one point. He said this: the moment we recognize our complete weakness and our dependence upon Him will be the very moment that the Spirit of God will exhibit His power. Again, he's simply saying that, as what Jesus is saying, when we communicate that we are completely dependent on God, that's when he moves, and that the power of God is demonstrated through us. When you look throughout the Bible, of these great stories of men and women doing great things, it was because they realized, God, I can't do this on my own. I'm completely dependent on you. And that's when God moves. So I'll just say this to you as a preview for tomorrow night's Pray Like This session. Remember, we meet every Wednesday night after we worship with the youth group. We meet every Wednesday night at the First Free Will Baptist Church of Tampa, and we're going to be continuing this thought of this petitions, bringing petitions to God and realizing we are completely dependent on Him. But if you want God, I'll leave you with this. If you want God to truly move in your life and truly to move through your prayers, you have to realize that when you're bringing those prayer requests to God, you are completely depending on Him to provide for you. And when you do that, that's when He moves. Anyway, thanks so much for listening, guys. Be sure to come on out again tomorrow night at 7 p.m. at the First Free Will Baptist Church of Tampa, where we worship with the youth and then continue our discussion on Pray Like This. Until then, have a good night.